Okay. Hvala, Vesna. Mark, do you hear us? Are you with us?
I do, yeah. Hi.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our colleague, Professor Mark Kojame, who is with us for the discussion part. One more time, I will give a short introduction if someone was not present today when we already mentioned his work and research. Mark Kojame is an associate professor of economics at George Mason University, where he conducts research on economic history. He is also a research fellow at the Center for Economic Research and Policy and a senior scholar at the Mercatus Center. His recent work explored the rise of religious toleration in early modern Europe in relation with state development and institutional changes. He is an interdisciplinary researcher, merging political economy, economic history, and many other interesting areas. Mark, many thanks for joining us today. And thank you for sending us your video that made possible to overcome these time zone barriers. There are many of us who attended your lecture today, and now is the time finally to discuss this subject with you. Since I am moderating, I will use my right to reflect shortly and ask first two questions. This is also a call for others to join conversation by typing the questions or just raising hands. So, Mark, by taking the time framework of medieval Europe in terms of religious freedoms, you managed to encompass small-scale economic activities, agriculture, craft, trade, guilds, demographic changes towards city in terms of organization, and also you managed to mention all important, almost all, challenges in times of proto-industrial and early industrialization. So the facts that those times are characterized in terms of changes in economic production, the powers were reallocated, the migration towards cities and demographic changes were intensified, especially in the context of the countries you mentioned, like Flandria, north of France. There were German colonization of Slavic territories. So the rise of poor, not only in rural, but also in urban zones, which will become the crusaders and the future proletariat. New forms of inequality also appeared, but not only connected, I would say, with feudalism, but also the trade brought opportunities to change the class. After, for example, good trade, people could change their class position. So I guess industry wasn't able to absorb all the mentioned challenges. Values, moralities played important role in general tendency of enrichment. And finally, first two questions. Do you see and how the movements such as millennialist fractions and other mystical religious movements contributed to changes towards the needed reformations in terms of conditional toleration you mentioned, respecting, having in mind their culture of everyday life and small-scale economic practices? And second questions, we could see in your presentation rich referencing regarding the culture and arts, so which represented the reflection of identities from the field of culture, of memory, etc., and how important is for you the sphere of culture as man-made part of environment when analyzing institutional changes in general?
Hey, yeah, thanks for those questions, Milica. There's a lot to go on there. So maybe I'll try and tackle the first one first. So in the lecture particularly, but also to some degree in the book, we focus on the political economy story, and we're paying a little bit less attention to the underlying economic developments, but they're undoubtedly important. So the types of developments you're alluding to, say in the High Middle Ages, so the commercial revolution, the settlement of Eastern Europe, the Germanization of the Slavic lands, the deforestation of the woods, and urbanization in places like Italy and Low Countries. Those are definitely important, partly because they're generating bottom-up religious movements. And so literacy is rising, particularly in Western Europe. And when you get literacy rising, you get more people questioning the status quo, you get more sophisticated arguments emerging. So basically, I think somewhere in the book we say that you don't really get heretics unless you have cities, because you need some kind of urban environment where people are discussing things. You need some density of literate people to get new ideas. So while we focus particularly on the political economy, there's this bottom-up stuff going on. Movements are happening, new ideas are coming forth, particularly in Europe in the 11th century, in Western Europe. I know a little bit less about what's happening in Eastern Europe, but I know there are millennial movements by the 13th century. So I'm trying to think of the best authors on this, but they're historians who've studied this in some detail. So when you get the rise of cities and commercialization and all those trends you mentioned, you get more inequality. And when you get more inequality, then it raises questions about social justice. So, and that raises kind of, religious questions about, will the rich go to heaven? Will there be a rectification for the injustices of this world? And so there are new religious movements as a result of those economic trends that you mentioned. And then the question is in Europe, at least in medieval Europe, is can the established church accommodate all of these new movements? And in the 12th and 13th century, mostly it can, to some degree it can accommodate these with the Franciscan movement and so on, but also to some degree it can't. And where it can't, you get the rise of these heretical movements. But these heretical movements are crushed fairly effectively in the medieval period because there's a strong alliance between the church and the state, and for various reasons I don't have the full answer to. But by the Reformation, they can't be. By the Reformation, by the 15th century, these developments reach a point where maybe through chance, maybe through kind of bad decisions, or maybe through the fact that secular rulers in places like Germany, Scandinavia, and also England use it opportunistically to break from the church and to expropriate church resources, then that changes the dynamic. So I don't have a full answer to your question, but to briefly answer it, I mean, there's definitely a lot going on in the economy, and that's generating some degree of religious change and religious pressure. And early modern states have to try to accommodate it best they can. And in the Middle Ages, they're able to some degree, within the bounds of this conditional toleration framework I outlined. But after 1500, they're less and less able to do so. Generates more and more kind of conflicts and religious conflicts. And then, in some sense, you need a new way of organizing political and religious activities, political and religious conflicts. You need a new way of organizing them to accommodate the increased diversity and the new set of relationships you observe after the Reformation, and it takes several centuries for this to play out, but that's how we think about this transition from a medieval world to a modern one. Briefly, the second question, I think, was about culture, right? How important culture is. So there's increasing recognition, I think, in mainstream economics, kind of that the culture can matter. And so culture interacts with institutions. So we definitely think culture matters, and in ways that previously economists probably neglected. I think we're not quite there yet in terms of thinking about how specific cultural things get manifest. But just to take an example from my book, which briefly mentioned in the book, because I can be more concrete. I think with the Reformation, the fact that you have a printing technology and the fact that people are literate means that when there's religious violence, so for example, when in England in the 1550s, Protestants are killed by Queen Mary's regime, then John Fox, who's a Protestant publicist, he produces this Book of Martyrs, where he's able to link the Protestants with the early Christian martyrs. And so that's a very important cultural phenomenon for creating a separate Protestant identity. And once that separate Protestant identity is created as a result of this, really, then it's very hard to go back. So it's very hard for the Protestants later to think about going back to Catholicism, because they've been brought up in a culture where they've been told that their Protestant ancestors were martyrs, and that their martyrs equivalent to the early Christian martyrs. And I think in an earlier time period, without the printing press, without a book like John Fox's Book of Martyrs, that would have been harder to have taken place. That wouldn't have taken place.
Okay, thank you, Mark. I think Alexander Matkovic, our colleague, has a question. Sally, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks. So this might be a bit off the mark in terms of your lecture, but I was wondering, have you ever considered Bogomilism? I've sent a Wikipedia article, because it's specifically, like a Balkan sort of religion. They were mostly anarchists, and they were prosecuted in Serbian lands, as far as I know, since they were opposing the church and the state, and they were kind of, as I said, they had this anarchist leanings. And basically, the craziest thesis I've heard regarding them is that capitalism in Serbia would not have been possible without the prosecution of Bogomils.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
I mean, that's really far-fetched, isn't it? But I was like, I was very curious, because I actually stumbled upon your work where you actually quote them just in a footnote. So you might, I'm going to send this in the chat box now. So this is the article I found where you actually do mention them. But that was kind of interesting. What do you think? Why did they were prosecuted, and what were the consequences of this? Because obviously there was some sort of economic benefit of prosecuting your own opponents to the system that you were.
So it's a great question. I have to admit a bit of Western European bias here, because when we count, like, so in the paper you linked to, which is also we mentioned in the book as well. So when we think, because I studied history as well as economics, and when our history is always focused on Western Europe rather than Eastern Europe. So when we encounter Bogomilism in Western European historiography, it's always linked with the Cathars in southern France, right? So the Albigensian Crusade and the Cathars, and they are alleged to be influenced by Bogomilism. If I'm pronouncing that right. So they're alleged to be linked by it, and there's alleged to be a link between this dualism of Bogomilism and the dualism of the Cathars. The modern historiography about the Cathars now downplays this totally, and it doesn't think they're linked, and it instead thinks it's the French inquisitors who are claiming that there's this link, and they don't really believe there's a link. But that's an aside. That set of beliefs, the dualist beliefs, they emerge. Well, the Cathars, we think, emerge because the church is weak in that period in France. I don't know if that's also the case in Bulgaria and in Eastern Europe at the time, but it's also seen as a response to the Gnosticism, or dualism is often a response to the problem of evil. So if you think that monotheism or Christianity or Judaism can't accommodate evil very well, because of why would an all-powerful benevolent God allow there to be all this suffering in the world, then that makes dualism a kind of potent attraction. And so in European history, we sometimes think it's a response to inequality, Western European history, because you have, like, how do you explain these injustices in the world? I don't know why it emerges in Bulgaria and in the Slavonic world when it does. I don't know. So that could be interesting. But why it's persecuted is it's often suggested that these very otherworldly religions undermine secular authority, and they also undermine things like, the Cathars at least were very against procreation. So we didn't believe in procreation. So they're kind of undermining institutions of society and state like marriage, and they might be undermining obedience to the secular authorities. Certainly they're undermining obedience to the religious authorities. So that's why they're seen as a threat. But I don't know if I or anyone has a very good understanding of why these religions emerge when they do. The only potentially interesting thing I can say is there's a German political philosopher. I'm just trying to who emphasizes the link between Gnosticism and modern extremist movements like communism and Nazism. And I'm just trying to remember his name. My mind has gone blank. But there's a famous political philosopher who links Gnosticism and dualism with modern totalitarianism.
Fritz Fischer, maybe?
I don't think so. He's German. I'm just trying to think about his name. Not Fischer. Let's see. Eric Voegelin. But I don't have I'm not an expert on the history of these movements.
Thank you, Mark. Does someone else want to ask a question or discuss with Mark? Okay, Marco, our colleague Marco.
Marco has a question for Mark. Well, thank you. I found that really interesting and inspiring. The lecture we had heard this morning, and I really found fascinating this explanation or theory or theoretical model, whatever you want to call it, with this triangle of between religious legitimacy. And if I understood correctly, the biggest challenge to that delicate equilibrium was happened at the time of Reformation for various reasons. Obviously, I'm not going to reiterate now the entire argument we have heard already. So my question was what I found actually. So I don't know if this is going to be a question or a comment, but at least an exchange of ideas. But what I found interesting is that, or let me put it this way, what can be a question is, to begin with, is have you considered analyzing or testing this model on the East European context? Particularly, I'm speaking, of course, about the Byzantine Empire or East Roman Empire, whatever would be the most accurate term. The reason why I'm asking is that this delicate balance. I mean, I'm not medievalist or early modern historian. I'm well embedded in 20th century history, but I have some recollection about the period. But that kind of a delicate balance in this triangle that you have mentioned, one can see also in the Byzantine Empire, and particularly the relationship between the state and the church, which is basically a mirror image of what was happening in Western Europe. I'm obviously oversimplifying it, but the logic is there. So I was just curious. Have you considered that option, or have you analyzed that perspective? If not in your book, then in your research in general. Just one small comment, because I think it would be interesting to you compare or contrast or emphasize your own arguments. But I'm curious, have you
so the short answer, I mean, I've got some thoughts now. The short answer is we've thought about it and kind of chatted about it briefly, but we haven't done any research on it. So I have no specific expertise, but it's definitely, we've thought about it. So one difference between Eastern Europe and Western Europe is the especially within the Byzantine Empire, and later when you have a rise of Russia, of course, is that there's a church-state alliance, but it's closer, and the emperor or the czar, the emperor, is more powerful relative to like the patriarch than is the case in Western Europe. And so there is a line of research which links, the Catholic Church through various channels to kind of economic and later political developments in Western Europe, precisely because the power of the papacy is such that it can pose more of a counterpoint to the states than is in the case in Eastern Europe. And it's not really the theme of our book, but I think it's possible to make the case that liberalism in Western Europe is partly a product of that dynamic in Western Europe, where you have a relatively independent church and a state, and at some points the state's more powerful than the church, often actually, but sometimes not. And it's potentially fruitful for the development of state-society relations. Whereas in Eastern Europe, at least the impression one gets as an outsider is the religious authorities are always more subordinated to the Byzantine emperor, and then later the Russian Tsar. Now, so that's if there's a difference between Western Europe and Eastern Europe, that probably is the difference. In general, it seems similar in the sense that you have periodic periods of repression, both in the Byzantine Empire and Eastern Empire of religious heresies. And heresies do destabilize the Byzantine Empire frequently. So in the 6th century, there's a lot of destabilization, and then later iconoclasm. And so they have the same problems, I think. They face the same challenges, and they respond similarly, as far as I can tell. If there's a difference, it's that the emperor is always relatively stronger than the Pope. And there's some arguments for why that is fruitful, I think, for development of liberalism in Western Europe, but we didn't explore that in this book. It might be, but it's an interesting topic.
Okay, thank you. This is what I was aiming. Actually, basically, yes, the emperor in the Byzantine Empire was obviously much stronger, but it's also, as you mentioned, it's a very dynamic relation, as it is in the West. I mean, it depends on the Pope. It depends on political circumstances. It's different in 9th century. It's different in 15th century, obviously.
But there's no Reformation. There's no equivalent of a Reformation in even Eastern Orthodoxy. So it's one other difference. Right?
Absolutely, nothing as close to successful, obviously. But okay, yes, thank you. I was exploring that.
Mark, we got one question. I will read it for you. When you speak about conditional toleration as equilibrium in which very weak states may rely on identity-based rules to govern population, what is meant by a very weak state in terms of institutions? Did this process included separation of social groups and how it worked? And I will ask another question. In times of crisis, risks of persecution wasn't intensified. You mentioned examples of Black Death, of climate shocks and cold weather. So since the winter is coming, how did this proxy came to your mind to involve actually winter times and cold?
Yeah, so I can maybe answer the last question first, and then I'll reverse the order. Well, it was my co-author Noel Johnson who came up with the climate proxy, so I have to credit him. Yeah, we were looking for something which was exogenous. I guess what economists want to look for when they're doing econometrics, and then the idea we came across the climate science work. So it's because people are interested in global warming. It's important to ascertain historical path of global warming, and people are interested in you've probably heard of the Little Ice Age and the medieval warm period. So the question is, how warm was the medieval warm period? And so we read about this fascinating research, and then we were able to use the data collected by climate scientists to try and calibrate their models. So these are they're calibrating models based on these proxies like tree rings and pollen data. And what's nice is that from around 1750 onwards, scientists across Europe were actually accurately recording the temperature. And so we have an overlap between now and 1750 roughly, where we overlap tree rings. We have the tree rings, we have a pollen, and we have the ice cores, and we overlap with actual accurate modern temperature data. So you can calibrate a model, you can estimate what the relationship is between those things. And we read about that. I mean, this is now, we wrote that paper quite a long time ago, almost. We began the paper actually about 9 years ago, I think. So it's quite a long time ago. We read that research and we realized we could just use their work. So yeah, it was my colleague, Noel Johnson, who's most responsible for this. And also then, I mean, as if you read up on agrarian economies in the Middle Ages, you always find that it's always successive cold winters. It's never one year is fine because you always have some surplus seed. It's when you have to consume your seed corn that you're in trouble, basically. So 2 or 3 cold winters are really, really bad. 1 is normally fine. Yeah, so then on the question of how we define weak states, so I think the way, at least I think about it, is rather than reasoning from a definition, I'm looking at the type of state we observe in the Middle Ages in particular, but you can think about early Middle Ages, high Middle Ages. So why, and what dimensions are they weak? Even seemingly strong states, relatively by pre-industrial, pre-modern standards, are to modern standards very weak. So can the state penetrate society easily? That's one thing. Can it see what's going on in a town or a village? And often medieval kings can't. They have to let the city or the town govern itself because they have no ability to enforce their rules there. So in that sense, they're weak. They're weak in terms of the amount of resources they're extracting as surplus from their kingdom. Medieval English kings, and I think other kings in most of Europe were like this, would have to travel from place to place. They didn't have a permanent capital because they were unable to permanently secure enough food to feed their court for the entire year. And so in all these dimensions, their ability to really coerce society when they want to is limited. Obviously, at any point in time, they might be able to kill people or might be able to do certain things they're less constrained than a modern state. But in terms of their ability to get what they want done, we're calling them weak. That's kind of what we mean. And obviously, because it's a broad theoretical argument, the definition of weak varies a little bit from different civilizations, different societies. So it's a broad generalization.
Thank you, Mark. I think we have another question in chat box. Does a person who write it down want to ask? Yes, Alexandra Fostikov,
okay,
take your turn.
So I'm also medievalist, so I'm interested for the next topic. How does immigration merge in the light of religious tolerance, freedom, and state in medieval period? So I am asking this because when it comes to religion, there was actually a very high degree of tolerance between Catholic and Orthodox Church, especially in medieval Serbia and Bosnian state, where we have already, as we talked, independent Bosnian Church. So I saw in documents and as I'm working on sex migration, that we have a very wide Catholic migration and Catholic existence of the number of Catholic churches in urban economic mind centers on one side, and on the other, we have the same situation, as I said, in Bosnia. And what is also I saw in sources that there were many marriages between members of those churches, and sometimes without obligation to change main confession. So I'm interested for your opinion about.
It's fascinating. So I obviously I have a superficial understanding only of what was happening in places like Bosnia and former Yugoslavia, well, historically at the time. But what I would say is, so this is my understanding, which is somewhat superficial, but Orthodox Christianity and Catholicism basically share the same sacraments. So there's no so when I'm reading the sources I've been reading, particularly for conflicts between Protestants and Catholics, and also conflicts between persecution of Jews by Christians, often it resolves around a sacrament. So Jews are sometimes persecuted on the grounds of desecrating the host. And so that's one topic which is very sensitive. And similarly, Protestants and Catholics, they can fight over their biggest disagreement is over the nature of a mass. So is it a sacrament and so on. So there's certain issues where it seems like people's beliefs or people's there's certain hot issues which could generate violence. And the main issue of conflict between Catholics and Orthodox and Catholics, as far as I understand, is the authority of the Pope, basically the supremacy of the Pope. And for some reason, whatever, maybe that reason doesn't provoke as much anger or violence, at least as disagreements about the nature of the sacraments of the Mass. For some reason, it must trigger something for people. That's my kind of superficial thought about that. Then I would say, even over time, so yeah, that's part of it. Over time, even in Germany, Protestants and Catholics did learn to get along, and there were even mixed marriages. So even interspersed with these episodes of war, Catholics and Protestants could get along. The people who are often persecuted the most are amongst Christians are people who don't believe in the Trinity. So that's again something which seems to spark persecution. So in Protestant England, the people being executed as heretics after the Protestant Reformation are always non-Trinitarians. So Anabaptists suffer persecution. And so thinking about this in my framework, the other thing I would say which might govern why there's some toleration is if you have a relatively equal number of people who are Orthodox and Catholic, or somewhat comparable number, persecution is going to be very costly. It's going to be, and so it can happen. You can, if a particular region is dragged into a war, like the 30 Years' War, then there will be religious violence often. But it's actually quite a high bar to persecute a minority if they're 20, 30, 40% of the population. Whereas if a minority are like the Jews and they're like 0.1, maybe 1% at most, 2% of the population at most, there's a small number of people. They live distinct ways, they dress differently, they eat different food. They're more likely to be persecuted in the event of a shock. But if you live somewhere where 30% of the people are Protestants or 30% of the people are Orthodox, persecuting them is just harder and it's less likely to happen.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Anyone else? Questions? Okay, if not, maybe we can.
I think Alexander has a question.
Alexander,
I think.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is just like again unrelated to your topic, but I was curious. Have you maybe considered the religious persecution in the 20th century, and most concretely Nazism? Because I mean, you probably know Karl Polanyi, and he has a thesis that basically the Nazis prosecuted Jehovah's Witnesses and all the religious minorities and majorities actually to go after communism, because as Polanyi considered, I mean, in his view, communism has Christian roots and individualism and the idea of the community, and also has some historical background to it. So I was curious, what do you think of his thesis? And I mean, another reason why I mentioned him is that he was one of the mentors to Otmar Spahn, who was one of the mentors to Eric Voegelin, which you actually, I mean, he criticized Spahn in this essay, so that's why I was kind of curious. Yeah.
So I haven't thought about that specific thesis, and it doesn't just off the top, just on the first hearing of it, I don't find it plausible. But I would say, so in the book we discuss the 20th century, and it's a brief discussion because the book's really long about, and we try to make sense of 20th century totalitarian persecutions of religion, and because obviously these are strong states, so it's different, and the argument isn't you get a strong state and you don't persecute religious minorities. It's only that if you need a strong state to have modern liberal religious freedom, but if you have a strong state, you can also persecute minorities, and totalitarian regimes cannot really abide alternative sources of legitimacy and authority. So I think totalitarian regimes will use a particular religion for some period, but in the long run, they can't really abide it. So I think we can accommodate our argument to explain some of the 20th century persecutions, although we probably need to spend more time on it than we do in the book. That's my main comment. But I think, though, that the totalitarian regimes, they eventually would need to eradicate religion if they had existed longer. So the Nazi state, for example, accommodates itself to Christianity to some degree, but I think in the long run it would have had to have really reduced the power of Christianity to replace it with basically a secular religion or a folk religion of Nazism. And similarly, communism obviously tried to weaken and undermine the church in Russia and Eastern Europe. And in Poland, the fall of communism was very much linked to the revival of Catholicism. So I think it's interesting to think about the 20th century. In our book we have one chapter on it, and it's quite short.
Thank you. Do we have some more questions? Or I shall ask again. No one? Okay, then I will ask, since your study of religion freedoms definitely gave some important universalities in terms of freedoms of contemporary world of pluralism, democracy, at least in declaratively manner. So what happened? Can you reflect with these freedoms? Did we defended them? Freedoms in general, such as freedoms as human rights, etc., which seems that are under huge pressures from economic policy and system in general. And also you can, if you want, share with us your methodology, because as I could see, the research you took 10 years of research for the need of this book. And in terms of methodological approaches and how did you get your second data, I would really like to know something more about it.
I'll try. Yeah, sure. I'll try and answer those as concisely as I can. So, in terms of approaches, I guess I was trained as in Oxford. I was trained as an economist, but Oxford has a good economic history group as well, which is actually also, they do more traditional economic history, so more country-specific studies and collecting data and GDP estimates. So I was exposed to a lot of traditional economic history, but my actual PhD was in economics, and especially coming to the United States. So I was already interested in religion and these questions. I was already working on these questions, like things like persecution and so on. But coming to the United States, I encountered a more of an emphasis on kind of using exciting or innovative use of secondary data. So if you think about the work of someone like Nathan Nunn or the work of Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, what they're doing is often they're using data some historian has collected or somebody else has collected this data often. So they're not necessarily going to the archives. So going to the archives is important and great, but it's easier to do it if you're in England and you're working on English economic history. You can, which I did do a little bit. You can go to the archives quite easily and collect the data. If you're in America, it's more costly to go to the archives. But I was inspired by those papers where you have you're using data something is used for some other purpose in a new way, and then you're combining multiple data sources. So you're bringing together the temperature data with the pogrom data together, and so you're combining them, and also you're using kind of the tools of econometrics to try and ascertain questions of causality. That's one thing. The other thing I would say is I was quite lucky at George Mason University, because George Mason's quite eclectic. They support economic history, and you can kind of work on whatever topic you like. You're not confined to work on a small thing. You can be quite broad, and you're also encouraged to try and write books as well. So that was important, because a lot of economists don't write books. They tend to write papers. So they write one paper on one topic, another paper on another topic, and if you think about your papers leading to a book, then that allows you to kind of unify some of the underlying research themes. On the question of liberal democracy and human rights, I have no special insights here, but I think it's definitely a real concern. And I imagine things are slightly different in Serbia because of the recent history. But in a country like the UK or the United States, in the 1990s and first decade of the 2000s, people took it for granted that we were a liberal democracy. So we're a liberal democracy. Well, liberal democracy is here to stay. There's no question. No one questions it. No one disputes it. No one even I would say in Britain after Tony Blair, after New Labour, no one even disputes that we need a free market economy and we're going to be part of the European Union, for example. No one questions it. And so now, since 2016, people do question those things. And so, yeah, it's an interesting time. And I think it's the type of research I'm interested in about kind of liberal states and toleration and freedom seems to be important, I think, because we need to better understand the historical origins of these regimes.
Thank you, Mark.
So I'm sorry. So Mark, if you ever have interest to work in the research in Serbia, you can account of Center of Economic History, of course, here in Belgrade, and we would be very happy to work with you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a real shame. I would love to have visited, so it's a shame we weren't able to do that. So.
Okay, you're welcome to come to be our guest in the Center for Economic History.
If there is no other questions, we can close the discussion, but also I wanted to say that I hope that this discussion was just the beginning of our future cooperation. Sincerely, we hope that we have you from now. So I know that we have many topics to do commonly. So thank you one more time. And I will the final word and the floor to our colleague Marco.
The only thing I can say is once again express my gratitude and pleasure to have heard the lecture in the morning and to enjoy this conversation. It was more than inspiring. And what else can I say? It's thank you again.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Taking the time and
really interesting. It's been really interesting and fascinating. So yeah, it's actually I was doing a lot of events on this book, maybe 2 years ago, and then a few last year, and then this is like I haven't spoken about the book for a while, so it was a lot of fun to get back into it.
Well, great. I'm happy we managed to organize this event and the opportunity as well. Okay, I guess we are basically closing for the entire day with your lecture. So let me thank all the other participants who have joined us today. And yes, I guess we'll see you all tomorrow, and particularly those who have their presentations, me included. Yes, thank you all, and goodbye until tomorrow. If you don't